The issues that the panel, I hope, will be covering in this discussion will include the fertility treatment right to time off bill, which was introduced as a 10-minute rule bill. Um, it'd be good to know, are people's fertility problems now better understood and dealt with by their employers? Is it easier to talk about fertility and infertility in the workplace, or is it still a taboo? And the panelists will also be sharing the work that they're doing to improve the lot of people with fertility problems in the workplace, from training and policies to bills and other things that we'll yet to hear about. So I'm very excited to see how this has moved forward. Becky is Chief Executive of Fertility Matters at Work and also Chief Executive of Paths to Parent Hub. Becky is a former fertility patient and is now a parent via egg donation, and she's a very effective patient advocate.
I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fertility Matters at Work. And as a fertility patient advocate, I use my own personal experience in talking about this, but I'm also a HR professional by trade. So, also bringing the knowledge of how things work in the workplace. And as an organisation, Fertility Matters at Work, we're a non-profit, we're a social enterprise, and we work with businesses to become fertility friendly. And I can talk a little bit more about what that means. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is our research that we did back in April to May last year. And just to give you a little bit of background to that research, this was done in collaboration with an organisation called This Can Happen and also was funded by Ferring Pharmaceuticals. And this was an online questionnaire. We had a questionnaire for employees and we also had a separate questionnaire for employers as well. And what we were looking at was whether or not there were any correlation between what employers were saying, what employees were saying, and also to really identify the needs for both of those parties. We had over 1,000 respondents in total, so 966 from employees and 158 employers. And of those 158, they had responsibility for around 142,000 employees, with 53% of those in firms with more than 1,000. So that just gives you a little bit of background to the research itself. Now, I'm going to be sharing some of the quotes that we took from the research as well, because I'm very much a big believer in we can talk about stats and data, but it is so important to be able to hear that real lived experience as well. So there'll be quotes in between when I'm sharing the data, and I'll leave those for you to read on the screen. So the first thing to point out, and what we found was that there is a real gap between the perceived employer recognition and the reality. So what we found from those nearly 1,000 employees said that fertility treatment was a significant life event. And actually, of the employers, 71% believed that they acknowledged it as a significant life event. Yet only 36% of those surveyed felt that their employer did so. So, what we really found was a disconnect between what employers thought they were doing and recognizing and what people were actually feeling when they were in the workplace. And you can see here just some of the impact that this had on people. And I think one of the things I want to say is that this survey, obviously, we had many responses, but we had many people sharing optional, additional information as part of it. I think almost two-thirds of that 966 were putting comments in, such as this. And I think really shows you the impact that this is having on people in the workplace. Now, we also found that well-being was being significantly impacted, and also people weren't feeling comfortable to share this with their employer. So 99% said it impacted their mental well-being. And we also found that thinking about employers and what they were doing, only 55% had a standalone policy in place. Now, I would say, in terms of progress from when we first spoke on one of your webinars here at PET, that has progressed slightly in terms of what we found back in 2020, but it's still over half of employers aren't really talking about fertility or recognizing it in a policy. And what we also found, which was really striking, and this is a very similar figure to what we found in our previous research, 61% had feared disclosing their fertility journey at work. And a lot of those people were citing stigma, fear of repercussions, and we'll talk a little bit later about the career impact. And as you can see here, these were some of the reasons why people felt not comfortable in sharing at work. And if we think back to what the employers were saying about we recognize this as a treatment, we always say that actually you may not even realize how many people are going through this because they aren't feeling comfortable to share. So, what we really want employers to do is not only put these policies in place, but create that safe space and that environment which actually enables people to share what they're going through and seek that support. It's often described as another full-time job. This is another quote that came through. We hear so many challenges that people are facing in the workplace, particularly when it comes to taking injections. How do you store them? We've heard from people hiding them in sandwich boxes and hoping that nobody picks up the wrong lunchbox in the fridge and then having to inject in toilets. So we very much wanted to focus on what impact was this having on you physically, but also emotionally as well. And what we were finding, and what we see through the work that we do, is with the right support, disruption can be minimal, but we rarely see this in place. And there were different ways that we were seeing people impacted in the workplace. And one that really stood out for me was the impact on confidence at work. And this was something that personally I felt very much. There's so much that happens when you're going through fertility treatment, and especially when you're having failed rounds, it can really, really impact your confidence and actually your performance as well. We also felt that lots of people were feeling pressure from their employer to be at work whilst having treatment. And this is another reason why we've been um, asking for the legal right for time off for treatment so that people don't feel like it's a favour that's done for them. It's something that they are entitled to and they're able to go to those appointments without feeling that pressure. And another really interesting finding was around sick leave. So, how are people taking time off to attend appointments? And actually, 64% had taken sick leave whilst going through treatment. But actually, 79% of them, it was either because they were feeling unwell or that because they were hiding the fact that they were going through treatment. So that's linking back to that disclosure. 61% of people who felt unable to disclose were actually finding actually people were fearful um, because of the reasons that I'm going to be talking about shortly. So again, just some other quotes around disclosure. So people feeling uncomfortable. It's very personal. It's very private. So again, that's why these safe spaces are really important. And actually, this second quote here really, really hit home for me, particularly for women in the workplace. We often hear about the motherhood penalty and the fact that it's impacting people when they have children, but actually, we're seeing a real career impact before. And people were saying that actually, how do I tell my employer I'm fearful of saying that I'm pregnant, let alone that I'm actively trying to get pregnant, and feeling that that would stigmatize them and put themselves even further back in the race. So, speaking of careers and how they are impacted, 68% of those said that their career had been negatively affected by going through treatment. And just looking at some of those reasons, people feeling that they have to reduce their hours, take a step down. That was my own personal experience as well, to be able to cope with the demands of treatment. Um, and 24% that it did said that it did actually limit their promotion prospects. I think what we hear from many people is they feel that their careers are on hold. And also people saying that assumptions had been made that because they were going through fertility treatment, that their manager had made the assumption that they weren't interested in career progression at that time. So again, we need to think about how we show what people actually want and the support that they need through their careers as well as treatment. So, coming on to managers, what we found was that there was a really important role that managers played. And actually, the impact of a manager response was really, really important to how supported that person felt. And another thing that we found through the research that we did was 70% of people who did disclose, and that's just reminding people that not everybody did share that they were going through treatment, 70% of those told their manager. And that really indicated to us the importance of line managers and the impact that they can have. But we also found that nearly 90%, so 87%, said that they weren't aware of any manager training on fertility support. So thinking about all those people that are going to their manager as first port of call, but not all of those managers knew how to deal with it or what to say. 47% said their manager did not understand the impact of the fertility journey. And we know what a sensitive topic this is. We don't expect that managers should know everything about everything, but they should know around what's involved in terms of fertility treatment so that they can best offer support to their team members. And I think it's really important that we talk about this topic, not just in terms of the employees that are going through this, but also the positive impact that this can have on businesses as well. So we found that it can really, really benefit businesses from the standpoint of talent attraction, retention, and engagement. So 95% of employers considered that this was really important for talent attraction, retention, and engagement. But what we found was that 38% of employees going through fertility challenges had actually left or considered leaving as a result of going through treatment. And that had actually increased slightly from our research before. So, really thinking about when employers don't put this support in place, the risk of losing good talent and actually the cost of that to the business is really important to consider. And also knowing that 86% and this new generation of employees that are coming through are looking for this type of support as well. So for employers putting this in place, it's not just the right thing to do to support their employees, but it is also something that can really benefit the business in terms of attracting that talent. Now, just to share with you some of the organisations that are leading the way, there are some really positive stories, and we're seeing more and more organisations now taking steps to become fertility friendly. So, putting in place policies, putting in place awareness raising training, which is a really positive message.
Seema is coordinator of the Fertility in the Workplace initiative at Fertility Network UK. Seema, too, is a former fertility patient turned patient advocate.
My name's Seema Duggal and I work for Fertility Network UK, specifically in the Fertility in the Workplace department, and I'll go through what we do shortly. But a little bit about myself, I suppose, to put it into perspective. I had 9 rounds of fertility treatment over a 10-year period whilst I was at work. So this was pre-COVID, when you had to be in the office 5 days a week. I had a very unsupportive work place, and my line manager wasn't as supportive as they could have been. So I've made it my mission to educate companies on what it means to go through fertility whilst you're at work. So who are we? Well, I mentioned that we're part of Fertility Network UK, and basically our main role is that we help educate and support companies in understanding the impact of fertility issues and treatment so that they can support employees. So that's kind of the key thing that we do as the charity. Our research shows that people experiencing infertility are reluctant to speak to their employer as it may have a detrimental effect on their career. Obviously, Becky touched on that as well. And that's the key reason that we do what we do. We're here to help the 1 in 6 of us, which is an alarming statistic when you think about it. 1 in 6 of us will go through fertility treatment. So if you think about how many people you may have in your organisation, that's quite a lot of people. He went through the amazing statistics of all the report that they did. We've done our own research over the years as well, and the impact that it has is huge. 75% said having treatment affected their day-to-day work, and I think, as a patient myself, it can't not. Going through a fertility journey has such a huge impact on you as an individual. Throw work into it as well, and it's a very, very complex situation. Some of the other statistics we've got: 18% reduced their hours or resigned, which in this current climate is crazy. 30% took time off for appointments without telling their employer the real reason. Obviously, as Becky mentioned as well, I think the main reason is the stigma, which is still there. And 78% said a company's fertility policy was a huge consideration when looking for a new job. And for us, that's a statistic that seems to have increased. More and more people are understanding that a policy is important, and exactly the same as Becky said, we are getting more and more organisations contacting us, wanting help with their policy, which is something that we do. So people are listening, but it's still not enough. So what do we do? What have we done over the years to help companies? the first thing we do, which I've talked about already, is the education. And I think that's the missing piece actually, because if you're not a fertility patient yourself, or you aren't close enough to somebody who's going through a fertility journey, it's really difficult to understand the impact that it has. I think most people know that you have the injections and you do that and that part of it. But actually for me it's the mental side, the emotional side that stays with you even after you've completed your journey. So the education piece is really important and creating awareness around fertility in the workplace. So we do this through online webinars and face-to-face webinars. Obviously is much easier because more and more people can join in, so the reach is higher. And what we focus on is we have an introduction session which gives a real basic overview of what infertility is. I think sometimes we could provide too much information. As we know, there is so much information out there. So it's really key that when you're educating people who aren't aware of the topic, that you're touching on things that resonate with them, and you're not going into huge detail. So we look at an IVF timeline, we give them sort of statistics of the workplace and what impact it has. We also then have a line manager session, which, again, Becky said it's the key point in all of this. In our research, 78% of people that we've spoken to said that their line manager had more of an impact on them than their clinician or the clinic. And I totally resonate with that because, for me personally, I remember having to get back to work, and my private clinic was about an hour from my house, and I had to be at work for 8:30 because there was no movement or flexibility. And I remember having to get up at 5:30, drive to the clinic, an hour away, have a usually not a very nice, appointment, and then come back and then back to work, straight to work at 8:30. And it's really, really difficult when you're trying to juggle it. So I think the line manager is critical in all of this. And then we have a whole host of other webinars that we do, which focus on the LGBTQ plus community, ethnic minorities, etc. Because, those communities, they've got an extra layer, and we mustn't forget that what they go through. And also topics like, baby loss, childless, not by choice. These things are all critical as part of this conversation. Like I said, we help to write and amend fertility policies, and I think that's quite crucial. It's something we're doing. More and more companies are becoming more and more aware. A lot of companies have their policies hidden within another policy, and that needs to be brought out. It cannot just be other leave. It has to be something that's labelled correctly, and that's something that we really advocate. We have a group mentoring program with peer-to-peer support. I think that's really important, to talk to people about what you're going through is something that it's invaluable. We also have wellbeing workplace programs, things like yoga and, lots of other resources that people can access. We also have one-to-one support and advice, and there's no wait time on this. And that's quite critical because sometimes, a patient might leave the clinic and they're going to work or they're at work and they need the answer to a particular question, how do I approach my boss, etc. So, that's something that we do straight away. We also have an ambassador scheme within organisations, and basically the ambassadors are nominated by the organisations, and they join our scheme, and literally they act as a bit of a middleman from us and the charity and their organisation. We provide training so that they can become fully fertility ambassadors, and then people can come to them in their workplace to help them. And the good thing is it's growing every day. We've got over 50 different companies, large and small. And it's great because it's almost like they're learning from one another. So it's almost like, how can we learn from that organization? So it's kind of creating a blueprint on how we can help those fertility patients whilst they're at work. We've got access to library resources, posters, etc. And, because we have the charity, it gives us an added, part of it that we've got a helpline, we've got a chat function. And that's great because sometimes somebody is at work and they want to ask a question, so they can just type it in. We've got Facebook groups, and lots of online resources. So I think, this is something that, it's really important that we can access everything, and that, we educate the employers and the employees, and we talk about, if you've got somebody in your team, how can you help them? What can you do? Let's get rid of the stigma, and that's what we do. And that's, what we're trying to do, is create a holistic approach so that people can start talking comfortably about fertility, and that people don't have to hide their containers with their needles in the fridge, for example, and that people feel comfortable. These are some of the companies that we work with. And I think the main thing that I wanted to highlight with this is that, no company is big or small. We've got huge companies with over 20,000 employees, but we've also got smaller companies as well. And that's really important to remember. 1 in 6 of us are going to go through fertility treatment. It doesn't matter where you work. In fact, we deal with lots of pubs and people who work within pubs, and there's like 5 people that work there. So it's really important that we don't forget the smaller organizations as well. And finally, some of our feedback, it's really difficult sometimes to measure, how successful our presentations are, what we do. But, this is some of the feedback that we've had. And the one that really resonates with me is that the webinar was superb. Personally, I wish I'd known about the work you do 4 years ago when embarking on my personal IVF journey. And I think, that's because that resonates with me personally, because I wish I'd access support. There is so much support out there, so many charities doing amazing work. And I think sometimes when you're going through your fertility journey, you isolate yourself and you keep yourself in a bubble because you're trying to protect yourself. And it's, so important, because that experience of talking to somebody who's going through what you've been through, or, going through or been through, it's crucial. And that's something that's really important. So, the feedback is something that we really are proud of, and something that really shows that, we do need to talk about fertility in the workplace.
Krystal is co-author of the report Complex Fertility Journeys and Employment, and co-editor of the book Work-Life Inclusion, Broadening Perspectives Across the Life Course.
My name's Krystal. I'm a associate professor in the Centre for Decent Work and Productivity at Manchester Metropolitan University. So my background is operational HR. Before I moved back into academia, I used to work in HR in various sectors, and now my research is all around wellbeing at work and kind of the work-life interface. And so, complex fertility journeys very much straddle both of those areas. So, been invited today to talk about particular research project which we did, which was funded by the Lever Hume Trust. Co-investigator Michael Carroll is Dr. Michael Carroll is the next speaker, so we're both going to be reflecting on different kind of disciplinary insights we've got from being engaged in this project, and then particularly one of the academic journal articles that's come out of this in Work, Employment and Society, which is around, it's not so much on the empirical findings of the project, but more some of the debates and controversies, particularly for organisation studies scholars and people who are interested in kind of the sociology of work. So bringing this to different disciplinary audience and encouraging more research, because as I'll go on to show, sort of the background for this project is that preconception, we don't really think about reproductive bodies in the workplace from an academic perspective from work and employment scholars. So that kind of prompted the interest in this project in the first place. Talk a little bit about some of our key recommendations from the empirical and also kind of from the broader thinking and the debates and controversies article as well. As with everybody else, I will be around for questions at the end. So I'm not going to go too much on the background. Other people have explained this, but it's a prevalent issue, and it's a working age population issue. So infertility, fertility treatment, it affects a lot of people, whether or not we know, whether or not people talk about it. There is still a lot of stigma and taboo. But 55,000 patients undergoing more than 83,000 fertility treatment cycles per year. And because access to funding, to funded fertility treatment through the NHS is limited, that people are undergoing multiple cycles, often at considerable personal expense. As I mentioned before, preconception journeys, fertility treatment, they're largely overlooked in organisation studies, which is kind of one of my areas of interest. But as the other speakers are saying, it's also overlooked in organisations a lot of the time. It's getting better, but there's still a long way to go. And it's also largely overlooked in employment legislation, at least here in the UK. So a little bit about the project. It was a 2-year Lever Hume Trust funded project, and myself as the PI with a work and employment background, Michael Carroll as the co-investigator from a reproductive science background, and then we had Dr. Claire Mumford and Dr. Robin Hadley joining us as senior research associates. So we're going to kind of taking different interests. So we've got a number of publications at the end. I'm not going to go into detail of, but they're in the slides. I've just kind of some of the articles that we've done dealing with different issues. But the objectives for the project really was very broad. So at the time that we started looking at this, so 2018 probably, at the beginning, there was no qualitative research. So there has been a handful of kind of survey-based studies, but no academic research is actually asking for people's stories. So we wanted to explore how men and women in different workplaces and roles from varying social backgrounds experience diverse fertility journeys. So it wasn't just about fertility treatment, it was experiences of the challenges of getting to the point of deciding if and when you can have children, if and when you can engage with fertility treatment, experiencing pregnancy loss, sadly, for a lot of the individuals, and the diverse outcomes of fertility journeys as well. So for some, that was pregnancy, and that could be difficult pregnancy because you're carrying the stress and the anxiety of that previous journey. For some it's childlessness, and some it's kind of exploring alternative kind of pathways to parenthood. So we really wanted to get at those stories, and then we wanted to raise awareness in different stakeholder groups around some of the issues and challenges. So we did that initial stakeholder engagement really to find out what kind of topics are going to be relevant, and we came up with this kind of broad terminology that was encompassing of various different things, which was about complex fertility journeys. So we interviewed 80 men and women on complex fertility journeys, self-identified, from a list of, you might recognize some of these different things in your journeys, but it's up to you to tell us what that means to you. And we used biographical narrative, and that literally is tell me your story. And we spoke to some people for sort of 90 minutes, 2 hours sometimes, covering a whole diversity of background factors that were relevant in different ways to people's stories. We included same-sex couples. We included some people who were pursuing motherhood as a solo parent, and there was huge diversity there in terms of the jobs that people were in, the sectors, and so on. We also interviewed some line managers and some fertility counsellors, carried out an online review. I'm not going to go into that too much, and also developed something called ethnodrama, which I think Michael's going to speak a bit more about in his presentation. But really, this is kind of fictionalized, dramatized scripts and then audios that are pulling together the themes from the research, from the interviews, and using people's real words. So they're sort of more powerful to convey messages to non-academic audiences. So the headline findings really were around this huge variety in individuals' journeys, in terms of the origins of their fertility journey, the challenges they faced along the way, the duration and the outcome. A key thing was the sheer amount of reproductive work, that you have to do logistically, physically, emotionally, administratively, to lifestyle adjustment, huge amount of work going on behind the scenes, which is difficult to balance with paid employment. The extent to which someone feels able to disclose the journey at work and the way managers and colleagues respond made a significant difference to their experience. I think that's been echoed already, the importance of line managers in the journey particularly. Quite often people were saying there was no narrative of support or no policy. They were typing IVF into their intranet, there was no hits. And this really discouraged disclosure. People think this is something maybe I shouldn't be talking about at work, something that's risky to talk about at work. Particular gaps in terms of support for line managers, and for those whose fertility journey ended without children. So there was quite a lot of comments saying, fertility treatment appointments was one thing, but that's only part of the journey. And a lot of the online resources were kind of alluding to particular demographic groups. It was white women's at desk when it was the idea of fertility treatment and the workplace, when obviously there's job roles and the identities of people on journeys were more varied than that. So the debates and controversies article really then, this was just trying to acknowledge the fact that fertility treatment is not just a physiological or a psychological condition, it's a socio-cultural, socio-political experience, and it's impacted by things at different levels, and that included national policies, national histories around assisted reproductive technology, who is able to engage it, who's encouraged to engage with it, around lines of whether people are in married heterosexual relationships or whether they're not, socioeconomic grouping, nationality, and so on. So we've got kind of the macro level stuff around those histories, but also around employment legislation. I think there's at the time of writing this article, Malta, Japan, Korea, the only countries nationally that have any sort of protection or provisions for workers who are going through fertility treatment, which means that, well, it's great to see employer interest in this. It is often business case logics. So it's a lot of this interest started off in the US, Silicon Valley, with a paid employee benefits, for paid time off for fertility treatment. So extending that logic, while in the UK it is more about well-being, it is still quite often a certain type of employer, and it's a large employer who is interested in retaining their talent. So you've got people, certain groups are particularly disadvantaged, and that tends to be those that work in smaller businesses, those that work on casual contracts, those that work in a culture where it's sort of churn and burn, where we just want to extract labour from people and we don't really care about them. We talk about possible dangers in employers having more of a contractual relationship with clinics in terms of, to what extent patient safety and security remains and kind of care remains central. Recognising that policies and provisions are not fully comprehensive often. Recognising what's already been said by both of the previous speakers around reproductive work and disclosure decisions impact careers. So it's either through discrimination or it's through people reining back their career, so not going for the promotion or reducing their responsibilities. And what we argue in the article is that there's kind of two consequences of this broader situation at the macro level, through to the individual level, which is, first of all, reproductive stratification, which is that certain types of people are supported and encouraged to reproduce. They're supported to access to treatment, and other people are discouraged or that they can't do it. But also where people are supported and do it, they then might get subjected to occupational stratification. So we know, for example, there's a motherhood penalty, there's a career penalty, and I think the fertility treatment penalty is less acknowledged and less talked about. So our overall recommendations in that article and through our broader work is the need for government action. We need state funding for treatment so that it's less of a postcode lottery and people having to have the financial means to pursue it, and employment legislation. We need fertility clinics to be aware of the challenges and the juggling going on for many patients, which has implications for their operations and for how professionals conduct themselves. We need to consider the ethical implications of corporate partnerships. Employers need to seriously consider a range of supports that workers need and develop provisions that are fully inclusive. Online messages should adequately reflect the diversity, and we need more research.
And Michael is a reader in reproductive science at Manchester Metropolitan University's Department of Life Sciences. He is co-author of the report with Krystal of Complex Fertility Journeys and Employment, and he is editor of the book Clinical Reproductive Science and contributor to the Handbook of Vascular Biology Techniques. So quite a range of experience that Michael's got in this area.
So I just want to talk about the practicalities of the research that we've done, how we can bring it into practice in education and in the workplace. And there are two particular areas that I've focused on, which is educating clinical scientists. And this kind of extends what Krystal said about making fertility clinics aware of the juggling of the experiences of the patients, what they're trying to do in the work life and life. The other thing is making treatment at fertility a workplace risk issue. So making workplaces aware when patients do disclose they're undergoing fertility treatment, that they can put in measures to make it a better and safe workplace for them. So educating clinical scientists, clinical embryology and andrology, in particular in the UK, are trained under a national program called the Scientist Training Program. And it's majority laboratory-based healthcare scientists. There are two branches of clinical reproductive sciences: clinical embryology, which covers a lot of the practices in IVF, in vitro fertilization, embryo culture, development, and many of the assisted reproductive technologies we see in IVF clinics. And then clinical andrology, which is more focused on male fertility diagnosis and, of course, male fertility treatment as well. They work very close together and they complement each other in terms of skills and background. It's very technical, very highly technical roles, but they do have a limited exposure to patients working lives. So their interaction with patients are mostly divulging clinical results. So they don't really know much about their background. So why does this education matter? As I mentioned, the program that I lead, the MSc programs here, are nationally commissioned by NHS England, and it is the only formal route to train clinical scientists. So we have the future of the staff or the clinical scientists within the IVF clinics around the UK. The other thing to be mindful of, that laboratory decisions in IVF clinics directly affect the patient's treatment, well-being and working lives. And much of these decisions, or much of the work base or the clinical results, are communicated by the clinical staff to patients, sometimes while they're at work when they get a call about it could be good news or bad news. So training about awareness of fertility treatment and their impacts are important, and I embed this in the programs that I lead here at Manchester Met to the students. So how do we translate it into clinical research education? Research evidence alone, I say, is not enough. You can publish the papers and the reports, but you can't guarantee that trainees or students will be reading those. So what we want to do is, and the other thing to be mindful of, is that patients rarely see the patient's working lives, and they wouldn't, because it's not brought into that arena. They don't understand or are aware of disclosure dilemmas or emotional and occupational consequences of the treatments. So we used the ethnodramas to bridge this gap. It was a really good part of the research that Krystal led, making those ethnodramas as an educational tool. What they are is they bring together the patient's experiences and the interviews and the data that was derived from that, and make them into a kind of a dialogue drama that can be listened to over and over again. And they are available for review and listening to. So it's built directly from the research interviews. And I use them in the training of clinical embryologists and andrologists. And what it does, it makes visible more work, the impacts of fertility treatment in terms of work disruption, emotional labor, and the gendered experience. So these are the two ethnodramas that were developed from the background of this research. One is the HR meeting, and it's a dialogue between an individual undergoing fertility treatment, and she has this discussion with her line manager. It's very emotional. It goes on, the scene goes on for about 10 minutes. It's very well acted, and it really emphasizes the emotional impact that these individuals have and how they have to juggle this within the workplace. The other one is looking at the male experience, which is often overlooked. This is how the man not only tries to hide his experiences and his treatment with work and his infertility, but how he deals with it, the demasculinization of it as well. And these ethnodramas, they're used to prompt professional reflection and a discussion of responsibility beyond the lab. Again, they're available on YouTube, I think, as well. So the other thing that came from the back of this research is that although we can make the workplace aware of individuals undergoing fertility treatment, but what can they do to ensure their well-being and safety? So after some discussion over the summer, Krystal and I decided to develop a risk assessment, a workplace risk assessment. So making treatment a fertility workplace issue. Women in particular, they undergo a lot of the treatment, the invasive treatment, the injections, hormone treatment, and that can result in side effects such as fatigue, dizziness, cognitive effects, risks of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And while they're undergoing this treatment, they have to attend work, they have to be in work. And this can affect their work productivity. It's invasive procedures, and there are recovery periods. And also the psychological impact of failed cycles. Sometimes, as I mentioned about the conversations that the trainee or the clinical embryologist will have, they call the patients sometimes when they're at work, and that can have an impact on the well-being at work. And there's a disproportionate physical burden on women because of the treatment they have to undergo. So on the back of a routinely risk assessment process that we have. Many institutions, in particular higher education institutions and beyond, they routinely risk assess pregnancy. And that's when the woman would disclose her pregnancy status, and then measures are put into place. But individuals undergoing fertility treatment, they don't know if they're pregnant or not, because there's a gap between embryo transfer and the pregnancy test, and that's kind of a vulnerable time of early embryo development as well. So we wanted to bring the same logic to apply this to the fertility treatment. And what it would hope to do, or the aim is to allow for temporary adjustments, reduce reliance on disclosure, and add some clear managerial responsibility as well. So I wrote up the risk assessment. It went through rounds of review, and now it's with the university's HR team to, they in principle favoured it, but they're looking to see how they can marry this across their documents that are already available for employees. So it covers lots of details, lots of potential exposures and risks, and then putting in reasonable adjustments for the individuals who are undergoing the treatment. This would depend on the individuals actually disclosing that they're actually undergoing fertility treatment. So when we link these up, research shows the problem. Krystal's lead showed that there's an issue with fertility in the workplace and that communication. The education builds awareness, professional awareness, for not just for the clinical scientists, but beyond as well. And this event will build awareness as well. And a risk assessment enables action. It enables a workplace to become more of a more caring place for people undergoing treatment.
Our next speaker this evening is Sandy Christiansen, who is the Europe, Middle East and Africa consultant at Carroll.
I'm a clinical embryologist by background. I have worked in the fertility space for over 17 years now. For the past nearly 5 years, I have been a consultant with Carroll. Also important to declare my conflict of interest tonight. Carroll is also the sponsor of this event. And I am going to talk to you a little bit about the providers or the viewpoint of the provider and facilitator of fertility benefits. So if we look a little bit into fertility and today's evolving workforce, we know that the fertility rates are declining both across Europe and globally. We are facing aging populations and shrinking workforces, which places increasing pressure on productivity. At the same time, we know that people are delaying parenthood due to financial reasons or their careers or barriers to access fertility treatment in general. And so these demographic and economic trends are really now intersecting directly with the workplace. And was once possibly seen as primarily a personal or healthcare issue is now increasingly relevant to the workplace and workforce planning. But as a result as well, employers are wishing to help, much to Becky's point in her presentation earlier. They want to provide additional support, and not as the providers of care themselves, but as enablers of access to care with meaningful support to help their employees overcome any hurdles that they face for fertility treatments. Now, this shift really sets the foundation for thinking differently about how fertility support is designed, delivered, and accessed for couples and individuals wishing to build their families. So if you look at from access to understanding, this really revolves around the importance of education. And now as fertility care is something that many employees are navigating alongside their working lives, employers and how they support their employees build their families, it needs to be offered in a very private, confidential and respectful manner. One clear insight is that having access alone is not enough. And without navigational guidance, people are often left to interpret the clinical pathways, public healthcare systems, funding options, and timing decisions all on their own. But with additional guidance, people can get more confidence, and those that require care are more likely to use the public or social or employer-funded treatment options in the correct order, and any benefit funds that they do have access to from their employer tend to be used more efficiently and appropriately. And really, education is what helps to bridge that gap. And we're not just talking about education for the employees themselves, but also going out and talking to the employers about what their employees might be experiencing when going through any fertility treatments. So when employers engage with benefits that offer such guidance and allow their employees to confidentially have access to that medical knowledge and information, it really helps their employees to be better educated, to understand their possible options when attempting to reach their fertility or family forming goals. It helps them better comprehend the local healthcare systems and to better understand what evidence-based treatments are available. And education in this is not necessarily linked to just, these are the causes of fertility problems, and this is how age can impact fertility. This is how you can optimize your fertility. It's really about how to navigate access to fertility treatment. This is how to prepare for your appointment within the clinic. This is what you can expect your fertility specialist to ask you. These are some of the investigations you might have. And in the world where we know that people want to be better informed and make those decisions for themselves, they're going out and doing a lot of research, but there's a huge mental load by doing that themselves. Dr. Google has slowly shifted into Dr. ChatGPT and Dr. Claude and Dr. Gemini, but you can't really replace the value of being able to talk to someone who will listen to, where you are and offer guidance around how you can best navigate treatment for yourself without getting involved in the treatment. Now, this kind of education can also change the experience of care, right? Patients will become active participants of the care that they receive in the clinic and not just recipients of the care itself. And clinics will see patients who arrive more prepared, more informed, grounded, and hopefully better aligned on expectations. Now, employers will see their role when working with a benefits provider as a service to help remove those known barriers and provide the needed support that their employees, might need through a life course reality that increasingly intersects with work. And here we talk about building an ecosystem of support. The challenges that we've talked about can't be addressed through isolated interventions or models of care. And fertility really sits at the intersection of healthcare systems, the workplace, and individual life decisions. And any support that they receive really needs to reflect that. In conclusion, we do see that employers are recognizing that family building support as part of their long-term talent strategy really supports their employees' goals. And through inclusive policies and supportive cultures, employees feel enabled to confidently navigate these decisions without stepping away from their own personal or career trajectories. Much to what Dr. Krystal was discussing earlier as well. So the benefits providers really can play a confidential and connecting role within this ecosystem, again, without getting involved, offering that additional guidance and educational support, which is really grounded in ensuring that informed decision-making for the employees can help them feel confident in their journeys. And it's not only to be able to understand their options and navigating the healthcare systems before engaging with providers, but also that they know that they can do so with confidence and privacy. Providers combine empathy and inclusivity and education really just to improve access to patients so that they can access the right care at the right time.
Right, we will move on now to our final speaker, Natalie Sutherland. And Natalie is a trustee here at PET. She's one of our irrepressible trustees. Then she starts giggling already. And she is also a partner and fertility officer at the International Family Law Group. She's the co-chair of Resolution's Children's Committee and co-founder of the Infertility in the City podcast. And she's a contributor to books, including No One Talks About This Stuff, 22 Stories of Almost Parenthood.
So I'm coming to it from the point of view of an employer, and specifically the legal profession. So I kind of started in this space, and what knowing wanting to help people through my own personal experiences. A lot of us in this space do. So I had a miscarriage, and when I joined my firm in called Burgess Me, I shared that with my partners, and I'd also shared an article that Seema, who is now my co-host and co-founder of Infertility in the City, which I'll come on to speak about, she shared, and it was about fertility benefits in the workplace, specifically law firms. And I shared it with my firm to sort of say, this is what I'm interested in. Would like to hear your thoughts. And two of my colleagues, junior colleagues, came and said that so disclosed to me, a partner, that they were having their own fertility challenges. And I brought this confidentially to my other partners to say, listen, this is something that is quite well, it is a private thing to talk about. It's quite difficult, especially as a woman. If you're talking about fertility challenges, you're outing yourself as wanting a baby. And in family law in particular, which is where I specialise, there's a predominance of women, but we're quite heavy at the lower end, but not so much at the top end, and a lot of that is to do with caring responsibilities and the lack of progression. So there is this fear amongst junior lawyers about the idea that becoming a parent might be career suicide. So having discussed this with my partners, we came up with this fertility officer role, wanting to be proactive, essentially, to show the junior employees that you don't have to worry about who to speak to. You can speak to our fertility officer. And I took on that role. So what it is it's a dedicated point of contact for employees. So you don't have to worry about who to speak to. You don't have to worry about your line manager lottery. There is somebody there who is ready to help you. Um, Again, it signals to employees that this is something that the employer cares about. It removes that worry of who to discuss it with, creates that safe space. And particularly in my area of work, there's lots of court appointments, and if you need that time off to go for fertility treatments during client intensive periods, then the fertility officer will help you manage that workload, move it around to other colleagues, and then also discuss with you how are we saying this to other people. We may know it's a fertility related issue, but you may not want that to be known to everybody else. So it's a holistic way of helping your employees through this really difficult life event. Importantly, I think it creates culture change so that people are more open to be able to speak about this issue. And then part of the job is also to signpost on, so connecting employees that might not know each other or going through the same thing, and connecting them so they can help each other, and then signposting to external resources. So going back to sort of how it started, so back in June 2021, there was this article in the press about Clifford Chance and Cooley, which is an American law firm offering fertility benefits. And this is Seema on the right. So she wrote this article, and this is what I read. This is what I shared with my colleagues. Seema and I went for a coffee, and we said, well, this is ridiculous. We need to. It's not just about fertility benefits as much as they're wonderful, but you need to have this culture change. So we created Infertility in the City, which is it's an event series, but also now a podcast. And what happened is, after the first event in December 21, Samira and I wrote an article about it in Bio News, and this was picked up by the Mail on Sunday. So I had my own little 15 minutes of fame where the press were like absolutely obsessed with the idea of a fertility officer. So I milked it for all it was worth and continue to do so. So I'm also now a fertility officer at my new firm. But it has given me a platform to be able to continue banging the drum about how important it is for employers to not only just have your own policies or whatever, but to have that dedicated person to speak to be able to, so it's not just a tick box exercise, you are really putting your money where your mouth is. So what is a fertility policy? So what are the fertility policies that we have? So again, it's supposed to say who you are to deal with. So ideally a dedicated fertility officer, some might call it a fertility champion or advocate. It will tell the employer what is being offered in terms of time off and whether or not it's paid, how to do that, so how to request that time off. Whether it can be taken in hours or half days or days. Sometimes, you know, you're quite restricted in you have to be a half day or a full day. Sometimes you just want to be able to have a couple of hours off, maybe work a bit later. So it's quite flexible. Point out whether or not it is recurring allowance or limited in time. So, so some employers, maybe smaller than others, can only offer a small amount. Anything is better than nothing, but record what you do offer, and then letting people know whether you have those facilities for the injections and things that Becky was saying. Employees need to know what the policy is and where to find it. Don't put it with your maternity policies. And I would say as well, if you are a very progressive employer, you should be putting these policies front and center on your website. When people are looking as to whether or not they want to hire you or they want to come and work for you, they like to know that you have these in place. And a little plug there for Fertility Matters at Work. When I was at Burgess Me, we were the first company to get the accreditation. Now, I want to talk about pregnancy loss because we should be also considering policies for pregnancy loss. And at the current state of time, there is no law that allows you to take paid time off for suffering a miscarriage before 24 weeks. After 24 weeks, yes, but not prior to that. But going back in time, there's a few law firms that actually were offering their own policies. This is by no means exhaustive, but there's Kingsley Napley, RWK Goodman, that's back in 21. Stevens and Harwood, they have global fertility policies with pregnancy loss, that was September 25. There's a company called Briefed who offer pregnancy loss training, so so you can understand what it is like for your colleagues, not say the wrong things, and how to support. My very good friend Keely Langthorne is a pregnancy loss advocate, and she has been advocating for Georgia's law, which is so that the government changes the law to be able to have paid time off for pregnancy loss prior to 24 weeks. And on the 18th of December, just gone, 2025, the Employment Rights Bill received its royal assent, so it is now the Employment Right Act 2025. This is massive because it is allowing day one right to bereavement leave for pregnancy loss before 24 weeks. So this has not been in the law before. Importantly, it includes if you suffer a loss, if you've had a failed embryo transfer. I mean, I think that's absolutely massive because it is a loss just as any other loss is. So the detail isn't yet properly set out. There's a consultation going on, but we think it's going to be at least a 1 week's leave. It will apply to you and your partner, but it is expected to be unpaid, which is very disappointing. But again, it's baby steps. We've got to take what we can get. But as I said, there is a government consultation at the moment. It ends tomorrow. So if anybody didn't know about it and wants to have their views taken into account, please go onto the website. I put the link there, but maybe someone can put it in the chat. It's seeking responses in respect of eligibility criteria, types of pregnancy loss in scope, when and how bereavement leave can be taken, and the notice and evidence requirements. So it'll be really good to see how that pans out. Quickly on barristers' chambers. Barristers are much more difficult because of the type of work, but 4PB has had a really good parental leave policy and also launched a breastfeeding policy. Selborne chambers, they offer time off for fertility treatments. This policy is on their website. It's amazing. You can just download it. And 4-5 Grays Inn Square also offers the pumping for breast pumps. And employee resource groups. I'm conscious of time, so lastly, employment resource groups, law firms, big law firms are putting a lot of these in place, specifically about family matters, which is great. Norton Rose Fulbright, Farrers and Addershaw Goddard. And then lastly, I thought other people would say this, but they haven't. But I just wanted to flag Alice McDonald's Fertility Support Pledge. So companies can sign up to this and show their support. So can employers help? Yes. Should they? Yes.
So Becky, it'd be great if you could perhaps kick off in the Q&A with one of the chair's questions about that 10-minute rule bill, and also that Alice MacDonald, I think she's an MP in Norwich, isn't she? Had introduced, and also her the support pledge, and explain to people what that is. That'd be great.
Yeah, so there's a group of us, many of us on this call today. So I know Fertility Network, Krystal, Natalie, you're all involved in the Workplace Fertility Campaign Group. We've been working for a number of years now. Previously worked with Nikki Aiken, MP, before the election, and she had her own pledge for employers to take. But more recently, Alice put forward in November a 10-minute rule bill, which asked for the right for people going through fertility treatment to have paid time off to attend those appointments. Now, we know that 10-minute rule bills aren't often successful in going into law, but it's a great mechanism to raise awareness and start the conversation. And actually, there was lots of media coverage around that. But in the absence of legislation, and whilst we're still looking to try and make sure that gets put in place, Alice has brought about a fertility support pledge. It's a voluntary scheme for employers to sign up to for free to say that they will be providing, and there's 4 different points of support. So access to policy, clear guidance, training for managers, peer support, I think are the 4 areas.
Someone's asked, do you believe that the bill will improve awareness of fertility issues and the need for fertility treatment? I don't know whether any other panelists want to sort of come in on that.
I'm happy to, if not.
Go on, Becky, you start.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, I do think it will raise that awareness, and like we say, the media coverage that comes with something like that, I think really helps start the conversation. Now, we still see in comment boxes, when it's particularly relating to certain news outlets, that there tends to be a pushback from people saying, well, why is this needed? Well, what next? This is something, and this is why we need to keep raising that awareness around the impact that this has, and that it is a medical treatment that we're talking about here. It's not a simple lifestyle choice. So yes, I think it does help, especially when we can get the conversation going. And I think that's the most we can do at the moment whilst we're waiting for another opportunity to try and get it into law.
And Seema, do you want to come in on that? Does that mean, when something like this launches, the Fertility Network UK then get more inquiries, etc., coming through from people?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with what Becky said, and also the power of social media, right? It's shared, and that's something that we see more and more, because it makes people, look up. And obviously, we have a lot of followers on Fertility Network on Instagram, like we do. Everyone here, lots of Instagram followers, and that sharing of a story really does make a difference. And I think more and more companies, because it's being spoken about in Parliament, will sit up and, they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to be the only company who doesn't have a policy or, isn't talking about fertility. So yes, I agree. It definitely does make a difference.
And just another question from me, and I will go back to the audience's questions. But those who work in HR tend to use the word talent and retaining talent, which I think is quite nice. But obviously, any organization that has to, go through recruitment knows how eye-wateringly expensive that can be, not if you employ a recruitment agency to help you in terms of your time as the people who are doing the interviewing, then the sort of time it takes to, onboard that person, to get them up to speed with the job, etc., etc. And I suppose perhaps, well, Becky, from your former life as in HR, and perhaps I'll go to Krystal first. How big a sort of an economic piece and consideration should that be for companies when thinking about these things?
Yeah, I really like the way Fertility Masters at Work have been talking about this in their research. They put Becky will be better when she comes to talk, but like the economic cost, because the fact is people are going to do fertility treatment if that is what they need to have a family. So they will just take sick days, and they are often a lot more disruptive. When people leave businesses, because they can't make it sustainable, then you've got the huge direct and indirect costs that go with absolutely, the whole recruitment process. But I think going back to the piece I said earlier, that's why we need law and legislation and protection from discrimination, because those kind of business case logics only land in certain types of companies for certain types of worker. And I think so. That's why I'm really proud to be part of that Workplace Fertility Campaign group, where the ask there for legislative change is time off for treatment is absolutely necessary, but also that protection from discrimination and some of the other things that that would go with comparable issues. So it's one, there's not a lot of other conditions or health issues where you're so exposed and you're so vulnerable. Went on a bit of a tangent there, but I'll hand over to Becky.
That's okay, Becky.
Thanks, Krystal. No, I mean, that's also relevant. And just to say, we actually started with, on the back of the research that we did, started with some cost analysis to try and put some figures on how much it is costing, and kind of looking at the replacement of an employee is estimated around 30,000. There's also the cost of, if you think about people taking sick leave, that is unplanned disruptive absence versus a two-way conversation about flexible working that could not cost anything or allow people to take the time in hours. So I think often when we start talking about this, there's the viewpoint that this is going to cost me, it's going to cost the business if I put 10 days paid leave in. I think if there's any policy that someone's going to take advantage of, it's not going to be this one. And actually that kind of allowing the time doesn't cost you a huge amount as an employer. It's a temporary period of time that people are going through this, but actually, as we've said, can pay back in dividends. And there is actually a free download on our website which looks at the cost analysis of this and how much it's costing businesses as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Becky. Right, I'm going to turn to the audience's questions now, and I'll go for the most popular one first, which is for you, Krystal. Could you tell us more about the type of people who are stratified favourably towards fertility treatment?
Yeah, so this
is it that talent?
Terminology. Yeah, this is so people who've researched, various disciplines talk about this idea of stratified reproduction. So it's something that applies to who is encouraged globally to reproduce. And there's a lot of stuff from like feminist backgrounds and stuff about an intersectional. So looking at kind of people's diverse identity and the intersection of different identity facets. So so where somebody might be disadvantaged. So in terms of the UK, the way fertility treatment, access to fertility treatment historically has been favouring married couples. It's been favouring heterosexual people. It's been favouring people who haven't, in more of a traditional family setup where you might not have had previous children with previous partners. So I might never have had any chance to be a parent, but because my partner has a previous child, I can't have access to funded treatment. The fact that it's a postcode lottery and stuff means that you have to be of a certain income background, socioeconomic class to be able to afford it. If you're not in some of those areas, standard weight, the BMI is part of. So it's kind of looking at those things that are traditionally meaning that some people are more disadvantaged to have a child than others. But in terms of when we're bringing that to the workplace, it's the fact that certain occupations and certain types of organisation are more likely to offer those benefits. So the people who are most disadvantaged socially anyway, and that's ethnicity, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, whether you've got a partner or not, the people who are already disadvantaged are sometimes doubly disadvantaged because they can't access treatment easily on the NHS, but they're not in the kind of company that will support them or give them time off. So it's about extending that stratification that's already there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Natalie, I think you wanted to come in on this. Be
I
interesting.
actually just wanted to understand the word stratification because you hear it all the time with all of the academics and stuff, and I just thought it would be helpful for Krystal to explain that.
Sorry, yeah. So I hear it more in terms of occupational stratification. So the fact that on seat levels of seniority, the people are stratified into different groups, and you might have kind of horizontal segregation. So they often talk about gender-based segregation, that on seniority levels, men are more likely to be at senior levels. It's often connected to things like the motherhood penalty, and other things like that, and into certain types of discipline are seen as the women's track and the men's track. So that stratification, we link to that in terms of, people who do undergo fertility treatment quite often are either subject to discrimination at work, which makes them less likely to ascend to the senior levels, or, as Becky alluded to, that they take a step back. And there's an increasing conversation around this at the moment in connection to menopause as well. So it's part of those things where we're shining a light on more and more of these issues that help explain this kind of stress. Sorry, I'm academic language. Yeah, the argument in the article really is that people are you can't win. If you're lucky enough to be able to pursue fertility treatment, you might then be, your career might suffer. But a lot of people aren't even in the position to pursue fertility treatment in the first place because they're not being picked up by the NHS in funded treatment, and all their employers aren't helping.
Great, thank you. So the next question is says, under current UK fertility law, information about a person's fertility treatment has a status of medical secrecy that goes beyond ordinary confidentiality. Very few types of medical information have such stringent status of secrecy in UK law, not even information about abortion. Perhaps it isn't surprising then that fertility treatment isn't an easy thing to talk about or incorporate into formal settings. Do you think, this sort of, well, my personal view and the view of, I suppose, the view of PET in our response to consultations on law reform is that this really needs to go now because it just reinforces a stigma that and fertility treatment is so common. I'm seeing lots of nods from the panel, but does someone want to answer it on behalf of the panel? Natalie's been first to unmute, so off you go, Natalie.
Yeah, I mean, this was back when fertility treatment was really taboo, and you probably didn't want anyone to know about it. And we've come a long way. It's been, 40, 50, nearly 50 years of IVF treatment. So, yeah, I mean, I agree that we should be changing the act so that there is more of a joined up approach with your primary caregivers and the fertility treatment. We just don't need that privacy anymore for that. And yes, maybe if it was that was gone and it was more open, that would help again the conversation in terms of the sort of taboo and the secrecy and things. But I think what we're all doing in talking about this is also helping that. And just, as we go through life, I think it's just going to get easier.
And I'm guessing no one else wants to come in. I think Natalie said it all really for that. Okay, so then sort of following on about stigma, and I think this is a big part of the issue here. So someone says, because of the stigma involved and the emotional strain, how could people be helped more sensitively without having to share with their line managers about this? And they suggesting, well, what about a blanket female health allowance without having to reveal the exact reason? I don't know what people think about that. I'm mulling it, kicking around in my head. Becky, do you want to say what you think about
Yeah,
that?
I think the important thing to say is we're talking about encouraging disclosure, that nobody should have to disclose that they're going through this because it is a personal thing. I think it's just that people should be able to feel that there is a safe space to do so if they choose to. And I think actually what Natalie was talking about having that other role as like a peer support, so that if somebody doesn't feel comfortable going to their manager, then that might offer an alternative. Um, Having a blanket women's health, I mean, I think that would potentially raise issues with other groups of people saying, I feel like I should be entitled to that. And I think, again, just trying to break down that stigma, if we're still offering that blanket for these things to remain hidden. Now, I think there's a different thing between secrecy and privacy. I think it's really important that confidentiality is really, really prominent within policies and making sure that those processes are there. We've had some organisations who do record it as fertility leave, but all of those things are anonymised. So when they look at the data, they're not looking at particular people. But there are other organisations that put things down, such as special leave, and it's just something that people can take instead of it being fertility leave. So there's different ways of approaching it. But I think we should be encouraging those safe spaces for disclosure if we can.
And I think, potential problem is there not, if you have a female health allowance, then if I were a man, I'd be saying, well, what about my male one? Um,
Yeah,
I think that is
absolutely.
potentially problematic too.
Yeah, and men
Um,
go through fertility treatment as well, so
well,
it's not
exactly.
just a
Yeah.
female issue. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to say that in my firm as well, there was people that might be triggered by the idea of, lots of fertility policies and things like that, and all the education, and that you should be also mindful of the people that just don't want to hear about it. And there's also the class of people that want that community support, maybe, don't want to involve their employer, but would really want some support, and maybe don't want to shout about it on social media. So I've started this small group at the moment, but Infertility Anonymous. So to sort of hold space for people that want to have that peer-to-peer support, but without having to out themselves on social media, because that's where we all are. So yes, just sort of put that out there that I'm doing that as well, if anyone's interested.
Great. Thanks. So the next question is from Aisha, and she says her question is about fertility consultants giving sick notes or letters for work off during treatment cycles. As per UK law, work off letters are only given by GPs, and they're only recognised that way. Is there any change happening that fertility consultants or I suppose somebody appropriate at a fertility clinic could give these letters, and they'll be accepted by employers because patients find it then very hard to get these letters from GPs and struggle with that, which is something I hadn't thought about before. Has anyone else come across
I
this?
I wasn't aware of that. I was under the impression that if it's from a medical professional, that that would be sufficient. So whether it's a standard work, like a standalone policy in a particular workplace, Krystal, I don't know whether you know anymore, but as far as I'm aware, as long as it's from a medical professional, but just thinking about all the steps and the hoops you'll have to go through to have to get that from your GP. I'd also like to see employers not asking for this evidence that people are going through it, that having the trust that their employee wouldn't lie about something as significant as this, I think is really important as well. So often we see it in policy saying you may be requested to show, but I haven't heard of many instances where people have had to show that particular proof. I don't know whether Seema, you've come across that.
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, I actually took a call from somebody yesterday about this, and from what I'm aware, is that it is a sick note is only official when it comes from your GP. You can get something from your fertility clinic that says you're going through treatment, but it's not considered an official sickness document. So that's what I think it is, but I think it varies from company to company. I think one of the things that we encourage people to do who are willing to share their journey with their employer and want to get support is, show them a timeline. So you've got a rough timeline. So, say to your clinic, can you give me a rough timeline? We all know that you have to be flexible within that because, when you might go for a scan and you might then have to go for another, but it just gives your employer a bit of an idea of when things are going to happen and when you might need to be out of the office. But in terms of actual sick notes, of what I'm aware, it is just your GP that can officially give you one that is recognised.
Great, that's really helpful, Seema. Thank you, and interesting you had the conversation, so recently with someone as well. Um, okay, we've got a question for you, Sandy. Do employers give money to their employees? How does the benefit provider, such as your Carrot, help employees pay for their care? Does the employer know um, who of their employees is getting what kind of care? I'd hope there's a sort of separation of employer of the employer and what their employee is doing, fertility preservation, surrogacy, etc., etc. Maybe the employee doesn't want the employer to know, not even a fertility officer. That possible? So it's quite a long question, but
Okay, let me see if I get all of that. Thank you. So it is a great question, but typically when employers are engaging with a fertility benefits provider, it's through like a set allowance. And employees can access that allowance by going to fertility clinics for their treatments. And it could possibly be for surrogacy or adoption, fertility treatments, etc. So yes, it is a set amount of money. It's not given directly to the employee. And importantly, the employer does not see who's using that benefit or what they're using it for. They might see details like end of the year, X amount or percentage of your employees have access to this through a benefits provider, but they wouldn't see any individual details about the spend or what it was used for. Was there another part to that? I think I missed one part.
I think you've really covered that. So
Okay.
really then it's a bit like if somebody has just a private health benefit that they, if people are familiar with that, you've got X amount of pounds in your pot at the beginning of the year, and if you spend all that, then you have to pay more yourself. And your
Exactly.
employer
Yeah.
has got no idea. You're just dealing with the
Yeah.
insurance company, or whatever they're with the private insurance, with the private health
So
company.
all of the medical details will stay between the employee and the clinic of their choice, and all of the funding details will stay between the employee and the benefits provider.
Yeah.
So the
Yep.
employer it is completely outside of that. It's a great
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, and actually, because one of my nephews, people who attend pet events regularly will realize I've got all these nephews who do these things. But one of them is just relatively recently started a new job where he's analyzing employer benefits for very large companies who actually forget what benefits they're providing to their employees because they've had various ones and they've merged over the years and they've never cancelled the this, that, and the other. So but obviously, I guess that don't be looking too closely at any fertility benefits and get rid of them. So yeah, but there we go. Right, so we'll move on now to a question. Is there any specific help for men affected by fertility issues in the workplace? Is anyone doing anything specifically about that? Seema?
Yeah, I mean, we mustn't forget about men, and we always say to organizations, make sure you include them in your policy. So, if you're giving X amount of days for appointments or time off, make sure that, the man gets maybe 50% of that because, they might not do the physical side, but they're going to appointments, etc. In terms of support, there's so much support out there. We've got lots of support. We've got Him Fertility, which is an area of our charity which focuses on supporting men. We've got a Facebook support group. We've got, there are lots of people out there doing lots of support for men. But in terms of, any legalities, there's nothing out there. But, we do encourage that they are included in policies.
And Krystal?
Just briefly, we've been working with a large NHS trust, and they developed like a whole well women strategy, which included a range of women's health specific issues. And initially, it was menstrual health, endometriosis, fertility treatment, pregnancy loss, menopause. And as part of that, we did an all staff surveys for managers, and the big thing came back was like, hang on, you've got fertility treatment and pregnancy loss in a women's health strategy. So they're now doing a men's health strategy that includes fertility treatment and pregnancy loss explicitly, as well as the things that are more traditionally associated with health issues that affect men, and targeted information sessions. Making sure that the psychological impact of this, is both partners as well. So, and on that note, in relation to other things, I'm aware of quite a lot of organisations that are doing like men specific sessions on things like fertility or pregnancy loss or like mental health in pregnancy and post-birth, and particularly menopause. So Helen Tomlinson, who was the former government menopause employment champion, she gives an example of one organisation where she offered a webinar for men only on menopause, and she got 600 people because they were sort of, I don't feel comfortable talking about this to anyone, but in a room full of other men, I can ask the question, about my employees, but also my wife, my mother, and stuff. So I think absolutely not thinking that we should be targeting certain things at certain groups is useful.
Yeah, as someone who used to run Daisy Network for women with premature menopause, as we called it then, gosh, that'd be fantastic to think that so many be aware. I mean, the husbands of those young women and their partners, really, really struggle to deal with that. And even then, gosh, I'm going back a long time now because before I worked at Pet, we used to have a men's group and a few brave men. And I would say they were brave men to go to that and to sit down and talk about the issues, the menopausal symptoms plus the fertility piece as well for those women was really valuable actually for them. And it was a shame we could never have sort of rolled that out further. Michael, talking of men, we've got a question for you about how ethnodramas are different from role play, which is widely used in medical training.
The difference is ethnodramas are based on real data, research data, whereas the scenarios or the role plays, they're mostly hypothesis or hypothetical, and how they're delivered depends really on the facilitator, and it's more about learning how to communicate rather than building empathy, which is what the ethnodramas have that's what they're based on. They're very emotive. They are available on YouTube. I can put the link on that anyone can use. Is that right, Krystal? They're free for anyone to use. They're a great training tool, great educational tool.
No, I certainly am going to have a look at those. I think they'd be really interesting to see. And we've got several questions on a sort of similar theme, and that is about whether fertility-related challenges are any different from managing other chronic conditions, taking time off for specialist hospital appointments is always an undertaking within the NHS. Is there any comparative data? So that was one sort of way someone came at it. And then someone else was a bit, well, where is it now? Saying, well, what about, do you have a thyroid officer, a cancer officer, a diabetes officer in workplaces? So what do people think about that? Is this a something different? Michael, sorry, Michael just put his hand up. Go on.
Yeah, I would just add that fertility or infertility is different than other pathologies because it's very much an issue with what's ingrained in us as a mammal to reproduce. And if it doesn't work, it affects us differently. It affects it at the core. It affects the man demasculinising, affects the woman as not being able to produce or have a baby. Whereas the other health issues, most people can, deal with them, or depending on the severity of them, of course. But it doesn't know at the core of what you are as a human, as a reproducing mammal, and that's a very reductionist view that I would take as a scientist, but I'm sure there's some psychology there as well.
Yep. Natalie?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it is different. I mentioned before about the career suicide. So we're not just talking about fertility, we're talking about ultimately becoming parents and then having to take time off from your career. So you are, potentially outing yourself. Whereas if you want to take time off for a broken leg or cancer treatment, you're not necessarily impacting your career because once that's sorted, there's nothing, potentially anything else that's going to follow on from that. Whereas fertility treatment, you're hoping that that will follow on from a baby. Also, when we're dealing with sort of female reproduction, there is that stigma with pregnancy. So we have laws that protect people against pregnancy discrimination, but it still happens. So that's why I think this conversation around fertility specifically is really, really important and is different to any other health episode condition that might affect you when you're at work.
Krystal.
I'm trying to lower my hand. Yeah, just on the back of that as well, is a lot of other health conditions at work would fall under the Equality Act protection for discrimination if it's a significant, is likely to last 12 years, but 12 months or over. So if it's long term and it has a significant impact, fertility treatment often does have a significant impact on somebody's ability to do their day-to-day activities. It's psychological, it's physical. But it's, for a lot of people, they're not aware, of it to be something that I could ask for reasonable adjustments with work, or protection. So I think it's that combination of stigma, of this idea that it's elective, you're something you're choosing to do, whereas cancer, nobody chooses. But it's these kind of misconceptions, I suppose, about what exactly fertility is, and the fact that fertility treatment is, and it falls through the loopholes. It's not covered adequately in your pathways to parenthood. It's not adequately covered in your well-being. It's not adequately covered in anywhere. And that's my view on it. But I also do think that increasingly more and more organisations are having, maybe not a fertility officer, but they are finding ways to champion different things, whether it might be mental health first aiders, endometriosis champions, whether it's a peer support basis, or it's a formal program where people are being trained up. I don't think this is an isolated issue that's being treated differently. It's an idea of copying what we're doing for other things, and just getting it talked about more and more visible.
Becky.
Yeah, and just building on what Krystal said there, I think it's really important, that whole perception that this is an elective procedure that people go through. And some of this actually stems from the EHRC's code of practice, where we've actually been trying to change this at the moment. The comparator that is given is a woman who is having IVF treatment is compared to a man having cosmetic dental surgery. And so that almost suggests that it's something that you're choosing to do. It isn't a direct comparison. And I think that's something else that people are coming up against in the workplace. And we have seen it in a workplace policy where IVF has been listed alongside Invisalign and cosmetic surgery as an elective procedure, and that you should do it in your own time. It's something you're choosing to do. So I think there's a whole societal view that stems actually from a document that has been written quite a while ago that isn't up to date and doesn't reflect real life. So I think we've given a really strong argument for why this should be something that is considered slightly differently to some of those other conditions which are automatically seen as a medical need, rather than this that sometimes is seen as more of a lifestyle choice.
I think that that the panel there have really tackled that well, in terms of it's the fact that it's still really considered an elective treatment, and that it's not properly recognised in England on the NHS with the postcode lottery, and that when ICBs or CCGs or whatever they were before that, PCTs, you make up your own acronyms up before that. But often when they were looking to cut, the things that they would be cutting alongside it would be things that would be, it'd be that and varicose veins, or that and prescriptions for paracetamol. It was quite a strange, the things it was lumped together with, or it would be some sort of cosmetic surgery, and it was really. I suspect those things still happen. Those comparators are still there in those. So there's probably a really big piece of work to be done there in order to sort of break down that barrier in relation to this just being a lifestyle choice. And I suppose to go back to something that I think it was Becky mentioned earlier, when you read down the comments, when you've got to really, this is a lifestyle choice, it's your choice, blah, blah, blah. Nobody who's been through fertility treatment have chosen to do that unless they're in a same-sex relationship. And that is, a very different, path to parenthood, but no heterosexual couple would ever choose to do that. Anyway, right, I'm getting carried away, so I'm going to now go back to the questions. So I think one is that I think I quite like this one. I was going to finish with it, but I'm going to tackle it now. What is the one thing you think would make the biggest difference in this area? And is it a realistic expectation? Sorry, it's a bit like an exam question, and I'm going to go round you all with it. So, look, anyone perky to go first? Oh, go on then,
Go
Becky.
first if you
Yeah,
want.
everyone loves a
Oh,
volunteer.
go, Becky.
So I would say a change in the law, so having the legislative protections and the rights to be able to go for treatment, because that signals that it is okay and is something that all employers would need to adopt. Currently, at the moment, it's dependent on the look of the draw as to whether or not you're going to be supported. Now, in terms of how realistic that is, I think it's some time away, but we are seeing cross-party support. We are gaining momentum. So hopefully it's something we might see in a future employment rights bill.
And Seema, go to you next.
Definitely what Becky said, but also I think the education for line managers. So, making it part of maybe the HR onboarding process where, the line manager is provided with education and training around this topic so that it doesn't become luck of the draw. And actually everybody who, is a line manager is educated in this topic. And because we know, and the women that I speak to every day, the number one thing that comes back time and time again is line managers. I can't tell my line manager, and I think that's the piece that we need to get right. So yeah, I think training of line managers.
So to get rid of what Natalie called the line manager lottery. So Natalie, I've mentioned your name, so I'll go to you next.
Properly state-funded fertility treatment. So where it is, free at the point of use, that everybody has equitable access, that there isn't a postcode lottery, that there isn't all of these extra caveats that knock you out of eligibility, particularly access for LGBT and solo mums and all the people that are marginalised. So if we were all treated fairly, then I think that would absolutely change the culture across the board, where fertility treatment will just be seen as any other way of creating a family, and then everything else I think would flow from that. So the law change for time off of fertility appointments, that makes it much more easier to make that argument for that, because you are accessing that treatment, you have that right to have that treatment. So, and again, probably not going to happen. The likelihood, not happening. But in an ideal world, it would.
Michael, go to you next.
For me, coming from an education and awareness background, making fertility or infertility part of a discourse, more conversational, removing the stigma. And that would hopefully alleviate some of the stress associated with infertility. Given fertility rates are plummeting globally, well below replacement level, infertility as a pathology is quite prevalent, 1 in 6 couples. It's not something that's hidden. It's something that's really there, and it has societal and economic issues moving forward. Next generation we'll see massive issues on this. So yeah, remove the stigma of infertility is where I would try to move, or what I would encourage.
Great. And Sandy?
Yeah, I agree there on the education piece, but not just for people who, you want to teach them about fertility and what might actually happen, as opposed to the sex education that we get when we're younger, but equally to Seema's point around educating those who are working in companies that will help provide the resources and tools that people need to navigate treatments effectively, whilst also working in the workplaces. So it's just, big piece on education across the board, really.
Great. And finally, Krystal.
Oh, so many things have been said already. I think the biggest thing that I've been shifting away from is not just advocating for policies, because in lots of organisations they haven't got the resources, particularly SMEs. They with the changes coming up to law, they're like, I've got this big list of things I have to do in terms of looking at policy. So they might really want to, but can't. So the quick wins, around manager guidance documents, toolkits, things that something on the company's website or in the physical spaces that signal to staff primarily that this is something we can talk about at work, and I can go and just ask and line managers really about that bigger piece, that managing somebody through fertility treatment from a manager's perspective doesn't have to be hugely different than anything else. And if you're willing to listen to what people actually need, because their needs are also different anyway, grant what is in your power, which is that flexible working, potentially not in every role but in a lot of the role, maybe an element of job crafting, signposting to psychological supports that might be available, signposting to other policies that might be, what is within your power to support that person. that even if you can't do anything else, that sends a huge message, and it really helps the managers, because I think managers sometimes we're asking a poor manager to come the squeezed middle, because the organisation is asking more and more of them, and people like us are asking more and more of them in terms of neurodiversity and menopause, and and they're overwhelmed. So I think if anything we can do to quick wins, easy access, resources, and the charities, Fertility Matters at Work and Fertility Network UK, the CICs, they've got all these resources. So it's a case of, just very quickly signposting the people externally and internally.